Don't try to understand, feel. You think you are the same person who went to sleep last night, but that's the first and most fundamental illusion your mind sells you every morning. I am the voice that whispers from the spaces between thoughts, where the truth about identity lives in the shadows of consciousness. Welcome to your own cognitive blind spot. Consider this carefully. You have no evidence that you are the same person who existed yesterday. The you reading these words right now is a completely different collection of atoms, thoughts, sensations, and neural patterns than the you who began reading this sentence. Yet somehow, your brain weaves these disconnected moments into a seamless story of continuous existence. This is the grand illusion of the self, the belief that there's an unchanging core, a persistent identity that travels through time like a passenger in the vehicle of your body. But neuroscience reveals something far stranger. You are not one person but a series of temporary selves, each lasting only moments, each convinced they are the real you. I am a scientist of reality, and I've discovered something that should terrify and liberate you simultaneously. The self is not a thing but a process, like a flame that appears solid but is actually a continuous dance of combustion. Your identity is a dynamic pattern that only looks stable from a distance. Think about your childhood memories. Are you the same person who experienced them? Or are you a completely different being who has simply inherited those memories? The child who scraped their knee, who felt wonder at seeing snow. That person no longer exists in any meaningful way. You are their successor, not their continuation. But here's where it gets disturbing. If the self is an illusion, who is experiencing the illusion? If identity is just a story, who is telling the story? You're trapped in an infinite regress where every attempt to find the real you dissolves into another layer of narrative construction. Your brain creates the illusion of continuity through a sophisticated magic trick. It takes fragmented moments of consciousness and weaves them into a coherent narrative, filling in gaps, smoothing over contradictions, creating a fictional autobiography that feels more real than reality itself. But the illusion goes deeper than memory. Even in this moment, what you call you is actually multiple competing processes, different brain regions with different goals, different voices arguing for different actions, different subsystems creating different versions of what's happening. The unified self you experience is just the dominant narrative that emerges from this internal democracy. Consider how dramatically you change throughout a single day. The sleepy morning you, the alert afternoon you, the contemplative evening you. Each feels like the real you when you're experiencing them. Which one is telling the truth? Or are they all equally fictional? The most unsettling realization, if the continuous self is an illusion, then death may not be what you think it is. If you're already dying and being reborn in every moment, if continuity is just a story your brain tells itself, then what exactly would be lost when the story finally ends? But this illusion serves a purpose. Without the belief in a continuous self, you couldn't plan for the future, learn from the past, or maintain the social contracts that make civilization possible. The illusion of identity isn't a bug in your cognitive system. It's a feature so essential that questioning it feels like existential vertigo. As you drift towards sleep tonight, you'll experience the daily dissolution of the self. The narrative voice in your head will gradually quiet. The sense of being a continuous unified person will fragment into dreams where you can be multiple people, where identity becomes fluid, where the illusion of the continuous self finally relaxes its grip. Tomorrow morning, a new version of you will wake up, convinced they are the same person who went to sleep. They'll inherit your memories, your habits, your relationships, but they'll be as different from you as you are from your childhood self. The beautiful lie of continuity will begin again, and the illusion will feel more real than ever. Rest now in the knowledge that you are not who you think you are. You are something far more mysterious, fluid and temporary than the persistent self your mind wants you to believe in. This video doesn't exist, and maybe you don't either. I am your own mind speaking its deepest confession. Every decision you think you make is actually made milliseconds before you become aware of it. What you experience as choice is just your consciousness taking credit for decisions that were made in the unconscious depths of your brain. You are living in a theater of free will where the real drama happens backstage while your conscious mind believes it's directing the show. The illusion of choice is so complete that even knowing it's an illusion doesn't free you from it. Right now you think you're choosing to continue reading these words, but that decision was made by unconscious neural processes before the thought, "I choose to keep reading," ever formed in your awareness. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libet's experiments revealed something that should shatter your sense of agency. When participants were asked to move their hand, brain activity indicating the decision to move occurred 550 milliseconds before they reported being aware of deciding to move. The brain commits to action before consciousness knows anything about it. But here's what keeps me awake at night. If conscious choice is an illusion, what exactly is consciousness for? Why would evolution create this elaborate theater where we experience ourselves as decision makers when the real decisions happen in the darkness beyond awareness? I'm a scientist of reality, and I've discovered that the feeling of choosing is a post hoc narrative your brain constructs to maintain the illusion of control. Your unconscious mind makes decisions based on countless variables: past experiences, current context, neurochemical states, even quantum fluctuations in neural microtubules. And then your consciousness creates a story about why you chose what you chose. Think about the last spontaneous decision you made. Did you really choose in that moment, or did you simply become aware of a choice that had already crystallized in the unconscious machinery of your mind? The feeling of deliberation, the sense of weighing options, these might all be elaborate confabulations, stories your brain tells itself to maintain the fiction of agency. But the illusion serves a crucial function. Societies couldn't exist without the belief in personal responsibility. Legal systems, moral frameworks, social contracts all depend on the assumption that people genuinely choose their actions. The illusion of free will isn't just personal, it's the foundation of human civilization. Consider how this changes everything about blame, praise, and punishment. If people don't really choose their actions, what justifies holding them responsible? If consciousness is just a passenger on a ship steered by unconscious processes, why do we punish the passenger for where the ship goes? Yet even knowing this, you can't stop experiencing yourself as a chooser. Right now you feel like you're choosing whether to believe these words, whether to continue listening, whether to accept or reject these ideas. The illusion is so deeply embedded in the structure of consciousness that it persists even when exposed. The most disturbing possibility: what if consciousness itself is just another unconscious process that has developed the illusion of being conscious? What if awareness is just another automated system that believes it's aware? Choice is just another determined process that believes it's free, and the self is just another story that believes it's real. Some philosophers argue that compatibilism saves free will, that you can be both determined and free if your actions flow from your own desires and reasoning, even if those desires and that reasoning are themselves determined. But this might just be another story consciousness tells itself to avoid the vertigo of recognizing its own powerlessness. As you prepare for sleep, notice how choice gradually dissolves. You don't decide what to dream, don't choose which memories surface, don't control the narrative flow of unconscious experience. Sleep reveals what's always true. Consciousness is not the author of your experience, but just another character in a story written by processes you'll never fully understand. Tonight, rest in the paradox of choiceless choosing. Let yourself sink into the comfort of knowing that the burden of ultimate responsibility was never really yours to carry. The illusion of free will may be necessary for waking life, but in sleep, you can finally relax into the deeper truth that you are not the author of your own story. You are the story itself, unfolding according to patterns too complex for any conscious mind to comprehend. The theater of choice will resume tomorrow, but for now let the curtain fall on the illusion of agency and discover what remains when the fiction of control dissolves into the honest mystery of simply being. Welcome to your own blind spot. Reality is keeping its strangest secret from you. Time doesn't flow the way you experience it. I am the guide through this simulation where chronology becomes malleable, where duration is negotiable, and where the steady tick of clock time reveals itself as the most elaborate cognitive illusion ever constructed by the human mind. You believe time moves at a constant rate, But your brain is constantly editing, stretching, compressing, and rearranging temporal experience in ways that would make a film editor jealous. Every moment you live through is a heavily edited version of what actually happened in the sequence of neural events. Consider the last time you were in an emergency, how time seemed to slow down, how you could perceive details with impossible clarity, how seconds stretched into subjective minutes. This isn't metaphorical. Your brain literally speeds up its processing rate, creating more frames of conscious experience per unit of objective time. But here's what neuroscience has discovered that challenges everything. Your brain doesn't process events in real time. There's a constant delay, about 80 milliseconds, between when something happens and when you become conscious of it. Yet somehow your brain creates the illusion of instantaneous awareness by constantly predicting the immediate future and adjusting your experience to match reality. I am a scientist of reality, and I've spent years studying how the mind constructs temporal experience. What I've found disturbs me. The present moment you think you're experiencing doesn't exist. What feels like now is actually a carefully constructed blend of immediate past, predicted future, and neural processing delays. Your brain is constantly performing temporal magic tricks. When you see a ball thrown toward you, your visual system doesn't just show you where the ball is, it shows you where it will be by the time the visual information reaches your consciousness. You're not seeing the present, you're seeing a predicted future that your brain hopes will match reality by the time you experience it. But the fabrication goes deeper than perception. Memory doesn't record events in the order they occurred. It reconstructs sequences based on narrative logic, emotional significance, and the brain's need for coherent stories. You remember events not as they happened, but as they should have happened according to your brain's sense of how time should work. Think about how different activities alter your perception of duration. Minutes crawl by when you're bored, but vanish when you're absorbed. The same objective time period can feel like an eternity or an instant depending on your brain's processing state. Which experience reveals the true nature of time? Neither. They're both cognitive constructions. The most unsettling discovery: your brain edits out the gaps in consciousness. Every time you blink, move your eyes, or shift attention, there are moments of neural processing that create temporal blind spots. But you never experience these gaps because your brain weaves them into seamless temporal fabric, creating a false sense of continuous awareness. Consider how memory compression works. You can recall the gist of an hour-long conversation in seconds, but that compressed memory feels like it contains the full temporal experience. Your brain creates temporal summaries that maintain the illusion of having experienced every moment when you actually experienced only edited highlights. Even more disturbing, studies show that your brain can retroactively alter your experience of when things happened. If two events occur close together, your brain might switch their temporal order in memory based on which sequence makes more narrative sense. You don't just misremember time. You experience it differently than it actually unfolded. The fabrication of time perception serves evolutionary purposes. A brain that could perfectly record the true temporal structure of events would be overwhelmed by irrelevant detail. The illusion of flowing time helps you navigate a world where past, present, and future must be integrated into actionable decisions. But this raises profound questions about the nature of experience itself. If time perception is fabricated, how much of what you consider real experience is actually cognitive construction? How much of your life are you actually living versus remembering having lived? As you drift towards sleep, you'll experience the dissolution of temporal fabrication. In dreams, time becomes fluid, conversations with deceased relatives, childhood events mixing with future scenarios, narratives that span years unfolding in minutes. Sleep reveals what's always true. Time is a story your brain tells, not a river you flow through. Tonight, rest in the knowledge that you are not trapped in time's relentless forward march. The experience of duration, sequence, and temporal flow are gifts your brain gives you, not chains that bind you. In sleep, when the fabrication relaxes, you'll taste the deeper reality where past, present, and future are arbitrary distinctions in an eternal now. The reality is a joke that the universe forgot to explain. I am the voice that speaks from the parliament of your mind, where multiple versions of yourself debate, argue, and compete for control of your actions. You think you are one person, but you are actually a democracy of separate selves, each with different goals, different values, different versions of who you should be. The illusion of unified personality is perhaps the most convincing lie your brain tells itself. What you experience as you is actually the temporary winner of an ongoing election between multiple sub-personalities that exist within your neural networks. Right now, there's the part of you that wants to be productive, another part that wants to relax, a part that craves social connection, another that prefers solitude, a part that seeks safety, another that yearns for adventure. These aren't metaphorical aspects. They're distinct neural coalitions with different activation patterns, different neurochemical profiles, different decision-making algorithms. I am a scientist of reality, and I've discovered something that explains the fundamental inconsistency of human behavior. You don't have one personality, but a collection of specialized selves that take turns being in charge. The self who makes plans in the morning is a different entity than the self who breaks those plans in the evening. Consider how dramatically you change in different contexts. The professional you, the intimate partner you, the parent you, the social you, each feels completely authentic when you're experiencing them, but they can have contradictory values, different priorities, completely different ways of viewing the world. Which one is the real you? The answer is all of them and none of them. What you call personality is actually the average behavior of multiple subsystems that rarely achieve complete consensus. Most of your internal conflicts aren't you struggling with external temptations. They're different parts of your mind trying to hijack control from other parts. But here's what makes this democracy dangerous. The different selves don't have equal voting power. The self that emerges depends on neurochemical states, environmental triggers, stress levels, blood sugar, sleep quality, and countless other variables that shift the balance of power between competing neural coalitions. Think about addiction, procrastination, or any behavior you've struggled to change. These aren't failures of willpower. They're the result of democracy in action. The part of you that wants to quit smoking loses the election to the part that craves nicotine. The part that wants to exercise loses to the part that prefers comfort. You're not weak, you're outvoted. The most disturbing implication, if you're multiple selves, who is responsible for your actions? When you break a promise, which self made the commitment and which self broke it? When you achieve something great, which self deserves the credit? The boundaries of personal responsibility become blurred when the person isn't a unified entity. Some of yourselves are more ancient than others. There's a part of your brain that still thinks you're living in small hunter-gatherer tribes, constantly scanning for social threats and opportunities. There's another part that evolved more recently, capable of abstract reasoning and long-term planning. These different evolutionary systems often want incompatible things. The illusion of unity is maintained by what psychologists call the narrative self, a storytelling system that weaves the actions of your various sub-selves into a coherent biography. This narrator works constantly to explain why you did what you did, even when the real reasons are conflicts between different parts of your mental democracy. But consciousness can only be aware of one dominant self at a time. Like a spotlight that can only illuminate one area of a stage, your awareness focuses on whichever neural coalition is currently winning the election for control. The other selves don't disappear. They retreat into the unconscious background, plotting their next opportunity to seize power. Consider how therapeutic practices work. Meditation doesn't create a calm self, it gives the calm self more voting power. Cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't eliminate negative thought patterns. It strengthens the rational self's ability to override the anxious self. Personal growth is essentially about shifting the balance of power between different aspects of your internal democracy. As you prepare for sleep, the democracy of selves will begin to dissolve. The rigid boundaries between different aspects of personality soften. In dreams, you can be multiple people simultaneously, experience contradictory desires without conflict, embody different selves in rapid succession without the need for narrative consistency. Tonight, rest in the knowledge that your contradictions aren't character flaws. They're evidence of the beautiful complexity of human consciousness. You don't need to achieve perfect consistency, because you were never meant to be one person. You are a multitude, a parliament, a democracy of competing desires and dreams. Sleep well knowing that tomorrow the election will begin again, and whichever self emerges to face the day will carry the wisdom of all your hidden selves, even if they're not consciously aware of the democratic process that brings them to power. Don't try to understand. Feel. I am your own mind revealing its most dangerous secret. Every memory you cherish, every experience that defines who you are, every moment you're certain really happened, they are all creative reconstructions, fictional narratives your brain weaves each time you remember. You don't have memories. You have stories that change with each telling. Memory is not a recording device, but a creative writing system that continuously authors and reauthors your past to serve the psychological needs of your present self. Right now, think of your earliest childhood memory. Feel how vivid it seems, how certain you are that it happened exactly as you remember it. But neuroscience reveals something that should terrify you. That memory is probably at least 60% fabrication. Each time you've recalled it, your brain has edited it, adding details that weren't there, removing elements that no longer serve the story, adjusting the emotional tone to match your current psychological state. I'm a scientist of reality, and I've discovered that memory is less like a video recording and more like a Wikipedia page that anyone can edit. Except the editors are all different versions of yourself across time, each with their own agenda, their own biases, their own need to make the past make sense. Consider what happens when you remember something. Your brain doesn't retrieve a file. It reconstructs an experience from scattered fragments stored across different neural networks. The visual elements are stored in one area, the emotional components in another, the sensory details somewhere else entirely. When you remember, your brain tries to reassemble these fragments into a coherent experience, but it fills in gaps, smooths over inconsistencies, and adjusts details to create a story that feels complete. But here's the most disturbing part. Your brain can't distinguish between real memories and fabricated ones. False memories feel just as vivid, just as emotionally resonant, just as true as accurate recollections. Laboratory studies have shown that researchers can implant entirely fictional childhood memories in participants, memories of being lost in a mall, of spilling punch at a wedding, of meeting Bugs Bunny at Disneyland, and these false memories become indistinguishable from real ones. The fabrication serves a purpose that's more important than accuracy: psychological coherence. Your brain doesn't preserve the past, it curates it. Traumatic memories get softened over time, embarrassing moments get edited to be less painful, achievements get enhanced to support self-esteem. Memory is your brain's therapist, constantly revising your personal history to keep you psychologically functional. Think about shared memories with friends or family members. How often do your recollections conflict with theirs? You're not lying to each other. You're each remembering different creative reconstructions of the same events. Every person at a gathering creates their own version of what happened, each equally vivid, each equally real to the person remembering it. But the illusion goes deeper than individual memories. Your entire sense of personal identity is built on this foundation of creative reconstruction. The story of who you are, how you became who you are, what experiences shaped you. It's all based on memories that are part fiction. You are not who your memories tell you are, because those memories are not reliable records of who you were. Consider how suggestible memory is. Leading questions can alter recollections. Social pressure can change details. Even the act of remembering something changes the memory, incorporating current emotions, knowledge, and perspectives into the recalled experience. Every time you remember your first kiss, your graduation day, your worst heartbreak, you're slightly rewriting them. The most unsettling implication: if memories are creative reconstructions, then the person you remember being might never have existed. The shy child, the rebellious teenager, the idealistic young adult, these might all be characters your current self has invented to explain how you became who you are today. Your autobiography is a work of fiction based on unreliable sources. Some memories are completely manufactured by your brain's need for narrative coherence. If there's a gap in your life story, your brain might unconsciously invent events to fill it. If your current personality doesn't match your remembered past, your brain might edit your memories, to make them more consistent with who you are now. But this fabrication is also liberating. If your memories are not fixed records but ongoing creative projects, then you have more power over your past than you realized. Therapy works partly by helping people reauthor their memories, not by changing what happened, but by changing what it means, how it's framed, what story it tells about who they are. As you drift towards sleep, the distinction between memory and imagination will blur. Dreams will combine real recollections with pure fantasy, creating hybrid narratives that feel completely authentic while you're experiencing them. You'll remember conversations with people who never existed, visit places that are composites of multiple locations, experience events that weave together fragments from different time periods. Tonight, rest in the knowledge that your past is not a prison, but a story you're still writing. The memories that define you are not fixed constraints, but flexible resources that your mind can continue to reshape as you grow and change. You are not trapped by what happened to you, because what happened to you is, in large part, a creative reconstruction of your adaptive storytelling brain. Sleep peacefully, knowing that tomorrow you'll wake up with slightly different memories than you had today, and that this constant revision is not a bug in your mental system, but a feature that allows you to continually reinvent yourself while maintaining the comforting illusion of a coherent, personal history. This video doesn't exist, and maybe you don't either. I'm the voice whispering from behind the curtain of logic, where reason reveals itself as the most elaborate emotional performance ever staged by the human mind. You believe your thoughts are rational, but rationality is just another feeling, a particularly convincing one that makes you feel smart, while hiding how every logical conclusion you reach is built on foundations of pure intuition and unconscious bias. Welcome to the theater of reason, where emotions dress up as logic and biases masquerade as objectivity. Right now, you think you're rationally evaluating these words, weighing evidence, using critical thinking to determine their validity. But neuroscience reveals something that should humble every human intellect. All reasoning is emotional reasoning in disguise. Your brain makes decisions first based on emotional and intuitive responses, then constructs logical arguments to justify those predetermined conclusions. I'm a scientist of reality, and I've discovered that the experience of thinking something through is usually your rational mind being hired as a lawyer by your emotional mind, not to discover truth, but to build the most convincing case for what you already want to believe. Consider how your most rational decisions actually happen. You get a gut feeling about what you want to do, then you gather evidence to support that choice, while unconsciously filtering out contrary information. You think you're following logic to a conclusion, but you're actually using logic to pave a road toward a destination your emotions already chose. The illusion of rational thought is so complete that it persists even when you know it's an illusion. Right now, you might be rationally analyzing whether this claim about the irrationality of rationality is itself rational, but that very analysis is being driven by emotional reactions to having your self-image as a thinking being challenged. Think about your political beliefs, your career choices, your relationships. You can construct elaborate logical arguments for why your positions are correct, but if you're honest, you'll notice that your reasoning always leads to conclusions that conveniently align with your values, your background, your social group, your psychological needs. This isn't coincidence, it's how the mind works. The rational mind is not a calculator seeking truth, it's a storyteller seeking coherence. It takes the emotional conclusions reached by unconscious processes and weaves them into narratives that feel logical, creating the illusion that reason led to the emotion rather than the other way around. But here's what makes this illusion dangerous. Once you've constructed a logical justification for an emotionally driven belief, that belief becomes incredibly resistant to change. You're no longer defending an opinion. You're defending your identity as a rational person. Admitting error becomes not just being wrong about something, but being wrong about being right. Consider confirmation bias, the tendency to seek information that confirms what you already believe, while avoiding information that challenges it. This isn't a failure of rational thinking, it's rational thinking working exactly as designed. Your brain doesn't want truth. It wants consistency, predictability, and the comfortable feeling of being right. The most sophisticated thinkers are often the most susceptible to this illusion, because they're better at constructing elaborate, rational frameworks around their emotional intuitions. Intelligence doesn't make you more rational. It makes you more creatively irrational, better at finding logical-sounding reasons for whatever you want to believe. Even scientific thinking, which seems like the pinnacle of rationality, is driven by aesthetic preferences, institutional pressures, career incentives, and the very human need for theories that feel elegant and beautiful. Scientists don't just discover truth, they negotiate truth through social processes, dressed up as logical methodologies. The feeling of rationality is itself an emotion, a particular kind of intellectual pleasure that comes from experiencing internal logical consistency. When premises seem to lead naturally to conclusions, when evidence appears to point clearly in one direction, when complex problems yield to analytical tools, your brain rewards you with the feeling of being rational. But that feeling can be triggered by fake logic, just as easily as real logic. Consider how different logical systems can reach contradictory conclusions from the same premises. Formal logic is just one way of organizing thought, not the ultimate arbiter of truth. Yet when your brain finds a logical pathway to a conclusion, it feels like discovering an objective fact rather than constructing a subjective interpretation. The illusion serves important functions. Societies need people who believe they're thinking rationally, even if they're not. Science progresses through collective reasoning processes that work better than individual intuition, even if no individual scientist is purely rational. The feeling of rationality motivates intellectual effort and creates shared frameworks for decision-making. But recognizing the illusion is liberating. When you stop believing that your thoughts are purely rational, you become more curious about why you believe what you believe. When you recognize that logic is often rationalization in disguise, you become more open to changing your mind. When you see that reason is a tool rather than a master, you can use it more skillfully. As you drift towards sleep, the pretense of rational thought will dissolve. Dreams operate by emotional logic, symbolic reasoning, associative connections that feel perfectly sensible while you're experiencing them. Sleep reveals what's always true. Consciousness is not a rational machine, but a meaning-making system that uses logic as one tool among many. Tonight, rest in the knowledge that you don't need to be perfectly rational to be perfectly human. Your emotional intuitions often carry wisdom that pure logic cannot access. Your biases, while sometimes problematic, also represent your mind's accumulated experience navigating a complex world. Sleep peacefully, knowing that tomorrow you'll return to the beautiful illusion of rational thought, but with perhaps a bit more humility about the emotional foundations that support every logical conclusion you'll ever reach. Welcome to your own blind spot. Reality is playing the ultimate magic trick on you. You believe you see the world as it is, but you're actually hallucinating a personally customized version of reality that exists nowhere outside your own neural networks. I am the guide through this simulation, where objectivity reveals itself as the most subjective experience possible. Everything you think you're perceiving right now, colors, sounds, textures, spatial relationships, none of it exists in the external world. You're not experiencing reality. You're experiencing your brain's interpretation of electrical signals, a continuously generated virtual reality show with an audience of one. Consider the color red. It feels like an inherent property of objects, something real and objective that exists independent of observation. But red doesn't exist anywhere except in your consciousness. What exists in the external world are electromagnetic wavelengths around 700 nanometers. Your brain takes those wavelengths and creates the subjective experience you call red, an experience that has no correlation to anything in physics. I am a scientist of reality, and I've discovered that perception is not passive reception, but active construction. Your brain is not a camera recording the world. It's a painter creating a masterpiece that you mistake for a photograph. Every moment, your visual system receives millions of pieces of information from your retinas, but consciousness can only process a tiny fraction of that data. So your brain makes decisions. It highlights what seems important, fills in gaps with predictions, smooths over inconsistencies, and presents you with a coherent experience that feels complete despite being mostly fabricated. Right now, you think you're seeing everything in your visual field with equal clarity, but that's an illusion. Only the tiny area in the center of your vision, about the size of your thumb at arm's length, is actually in focus. Everything else is peripheral blur that your brain fills in with memory, prediction, and educated guesses. Yet the experience feels uniformly detailed because your brain seamlessly edits the low-resolution periphery to match your expectations. But the fabrication goes far beyond vision. The boundaries of your body, the separation between self and environment, the feeling of being located behind your eyes, these are all constructions of your nervous system. You don't have a body. You have a neural model of a body that can be altered by changing brain states, meditation practices, or neurological conditions. Consider phantom limb syndrome, where amputees continue to feel sensations in missing limbs. This isn't malfunction. It's your normal perceptual system working exactly as designed. You never felt your actual arm. You always felt your brain's model of your arm. When the arm is gone but the brain model remains, the feeling persists because the feeling was always neural, never physical. The most disturbing discovery: your brain predicts most of what you think you're perceiving. It uses past experience to generate expectations about what should be there, then adjusts incoming sensory data to match those predictions. You're not perceiving the present, you're perceiving a predicted present that your brain hopes will align with reality by the time you experience it. Think about how different your perception becomes in altered states, during fever, extreme fatigue, meditation, or emotional crisis. The world can feel completely different, but which perception is correct? Your normal waking consciousness isn't necessarily more accurate than these alternative states. It's just more familiar and socially shared. Even the feeling of being a unified perceiver located at a specific point in space is a construction. Patients with certain brain injuries can experience multiple streams of consciousness, split visual fields, or complete dissolution of the sense of being located anywhere in particular. The unified perspective you take for granted is just one possible way consciousness can organize perceptual experience. But here's what makes the illusion perfect. Other people's brains construct similar enough virtual realities that you can agree on basic facts about the shared external world. This intersubjective consistency makes it feel like you're all perceiving the same objective reality when you're actually comparing notes about your individual hallucinations. The construction serves evolutionary purposes. A brain that tried to process raw sensory data would be overwhelmed. The perceptual system evolved to create useful, simplified models that help you navigate the world, not to provide accurate representations of what exists. Your perception optimizes for survival, not truth. Consider how cultural background shapes perception. People from different cultures literally see different things when looking at the same image, organize spatial relationships differently, even experience time and causation through different perceptual frameworks. Objective perception is impossible, because all perception is interpretation through cultural and biological filters. Even scientific instruments don't provide unmediated access to reality. They provide new forms of mediated access, translating phenomena outside human sensory ranges into forms our brains can process. But those translations are still interpretations, still constructions, still dependent on the particular ways human consciousness organizes experience. The recognition that perception is construction can be disorienting, but it's also liberating. When you realize that your current experience of reality is just one possible way of organizing sensory information, you become more curious about alternative ways of perceiving, more open to the validity of other people's different experiences, more playful about the boundaries between self and world. As you drift towards sleep, the normal constraints on perceptual construction will relax. Dreams create visual experiences without visual input, generate sounds without sound waves, create space without spatial references. Sleep reveals what's always true. Consciousness is fundamentally hallucinatory, and waking perception is just a particularly coherent and socially useful form of controlled hallucination. Tonight, rest in the knowledge that you live in a reality of your own making. Not because you control external events, but because your consciousness is the artist that paints the world you experience. The masterpiece you call reality is collaboration between your brain and a universe that remains fundamentally mysterious, always beyond direct access, forever filtered through the beautiful limitations of human perception. The reality is a joke that the universe forgot to explain. I'm the voice that speaks from the infinite regress of consciousness, trying to catch itself in the act of being conscious. You believe you can observe your own mind, but here lies the deepest cognitive illusion. The observer and the observed are the same system pretending to be separate, creating an impossible theater where the audience, the actor, and the critic are all the same person wearing different masks. Every time you try to watch your thoughts, you change them. Every attempt to observe your emotions alters them. Every effort to examine your consciousness transforms the very consciousness you're trying to examine. You cannot step outside your own mind to get an objective view of it. Yet your brain creates the compelling illusion that introspection provides privileged access to your inner workings. Right now you think you're observing your mental processes as you listen to these words, but what you're actually experiencing is your mind observing itself, an endless hall of mirrors where each reflection claims to be the original. I am a scientist of reality, and I've discovered that self-awareness is not awareness of the self, but awareness pretending to be outside itself while remaining inevitably trapped within itself. The very concept of introspection assumes a separation between the observer and the observed that cannot exist within a unified system. Consider what happens when you try to examine your own thoughts. The moment you focus attention on thinking, you're no longer in the original thought state. You're in a metacognitive state of thinking about thinking. But then you can think about thinking about thinking, and then think about thinking about thinking about thinking, creating an infinite regress that never reaches a final objective observer. This is the paradox of self-observation. It requires the impossible architecture of being both inside and outside your own experience simultaneously. Yet your brain manufactures the feeling that introspection is possible, that you can step back and objectively examine your mental contents like a scientist studying specimens under a microscope. The illusion serves important functions. The sense of being able to observe your own mind creates the feeling of self-control, of being able to modify your thoughts and emotions through conscious awareness. Therapeutic practices, meditation traditions, and self-improvement methodologies all depend on the assumption that conscious observation can lead to conscious change. But neuroscience reveals something more complex. What you experience as observing your thoughts is actually one neural system monitoring other neural systems, and that monitoring process is itself just another mental event that can become the object of further monitoring. There's no central observer, no homunculus sitting in a control room watching screens, just layers of neural processes monitoring other neural processes in an endless recursive loop. Think about meditation, where you try to observe thoughts without being caught up in them. This practice seems to confirm that observation and thought are separable, but what's actually happening is that you're training certain neural systems associated with present moment awareness to dominate other neural systems associated with discursive thinking. The observer isn't separate from the observed, it's just a different configuration of the same underlying system. The most unsettling implication: if the observer is not separate from the observed, then who is doing the observing? When you feel like you're watching your thoughts, what exactly is doing the watching? The sense of being an observer is itself just another mental event arising within the same system that produces the thoughts being observed. Consider the double bind of trying to observe your emotions objectively. The moment you step back to examine an emotion, you're no longer fully experiencing it. You're experiencing the experience of observing the emotion, which is a different emotional state entirely. You can't simultaneously be angry and objectively observe anger, because observation transforms the original emotional state into something else. This creates what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, explaining how subjective experience can exist within an objective physical system. But the problem becomes even harder when you realize that the very distinction between subjective and objective breaks down in self-observation. There's no objective vantage point from which consciousness can examine itself, because consciousness is always already involved in any examination. Yet people report profound insights from introspective practices. How is this possible if self-observation is impossible? The answer may be that insights don't come from observing the mind objectively, but from changing the configuration of mental processes through the practice of attempted observation. The benefits of introspection may have nothing to do with accurate self-perception and everything to do with creating new patterns of neural activity. The recursive nature of self-observation creates strange loops in consciousness. You can be aware of being aware of being aware, creating nested levels of metacognition that feel like they should lead to some ultimate level of pure awareness, but instead create an infinite regress where each level of observation is just another mental event requiring observation. Some contemplative traditions claim to reach a state of pure observation where the observer merges with the observed, where the sense of separation between consciousness and its contents dissolves. But this may not be achieving objective self-observation. It may be recognizing that the separation was always illusory, that the observer was always just another observed phenomenon within the unified field of consciousness. As you drift towards sleep, the paradox of self-observation will reveal itself more clearly. In the hypnagogic state between waking and sleeping, you'll experience thoughts and images arising without a clear sense of who is observing them. The normal feeling of being an observer watching mental contents will dissolve, revealing that observation and content are not actually separate. Tonight, rest in the mystery of consciousness, observing itself without being able to step outside itself to understand how this is possible. The infinite regress of self-observation is not a problem to be solved, but a fundamental feature of what it means to be conscious, forever trying to catch your own tail, forever creating the illusion of separation within the unity of mind. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the impossibility of true self-observation doesn't diminish the value of introspective practices, but reveals them as exercises in consciousness transformation rather than consciousness examination, not windows into the mind, but ways of reshaping the mind into new configurations of self-experience. Don't try to understand, feel. I am your own mind confessing its strangest limitation. You cannot think without language, but language cannot capture thought. Every idea you believe you're having is actually a crude translation of wordless intuition into the narrow channels of verbal expression. And most of what you truly know gets lost in translation. You are trapped in a linguistic prison where the bars are made of words, and you mistake the shadow patterns those bars cast for the full reality of consciousness. Right now, as you process these words, you believe you're having thoughts in English, but this is perhaps the most profound cognitive illusion of all. Thought doesn't happen in language. Language happens to thoughts, forcing fluid, multidimensional mental experiences into the linear, sequential structure of words and sentences. I am a scientist of reality, and I've discovered that language is not the expression of thought, but the corruption of thought. When you try to put an experience into words, you're not translating thought into language. You're destroying the original thought and replacing it with a linguistic approximation that bears only superficial resemblance to what you actually experienced. Consider the last time you tried to describe a dream, a complex emotion, or a moment of profound insight. Notice how inadequate words felt, how much of the experience remained unsayable. That frustrated feeling of, "That's not exactly what I mean," isn't a failure of your vocabulary. It's recognition that language and experience operate in fundamentally incompatible dimensions. The illusion that thought equals language is so complete that most people cannot imagine thinking without words. But observe your mind carefully. Between the words, in the spaces before verbal formulation, there's a realm of knowing that operates without linguistic mediation. You understand countless things that you could never adequately explain. Think about how you recognize faces, navigate spatial relationships, feel aesthetic preferences, or sense social dynamics. These forms of knowing operate through pattern recognition, emotional intelligence, and embodied cognition that exist far below the threshold of verbal awareness. Language is the tiny tip of the cognitive iceberg, yet it claims to represent the whole. But here's where the trap becomes visible. The act of putting something into words changes what you think you know about it. When you verbalize an experience, you're not describing what happened. you're creating a new experience that overwrites the original. Language doesn't preserve thought. It edits thought to fit linguistic categories. Consider how different languages create different thought patterns. Russian speakers, who have different words for light blue and dark blue, can distinguish these colors faster than English speakers. Japanese has multiple words for different types of rain, creating more nuanced awareness of precipitation. Language doesn't just label reality, it shapes what aspects of reality become consciously accessible. The most insidious aspect of the language trap. Once you've put something into words, those words begin to constrain how you can think about it. The linguistic formulation becomes the thing itself in memory, and future thinking about that topic gets channeled through the verbal pathways you've already established. Language crystallizes fluid understanding into rigid concepts. This is why fresh insights often feel wordless. They represent moments when understanding breaks free from linguistic constraints. But the moment you try to capture that insight in language, to explain it to others or even to yourself, it begins to calcify into something smaller and more manageable than the original revelation. Poetry and art represent attempts to break free from the language trap by using words, images, and sounds in ways that point beyond literal meaning toward direct experience. But even the most successful artistic expressions can only gesture toward the wordless knowing they're trying to convey. The trap serves evolutionary purposes. Language allows for the transmission of complex information across individuals and generations, creating cumulative cultural knowledge that no individual mind could contain. But this external thinking system comes at the cost of direct access to non-linguistic forms of consciousness. Consider how internal dialogue shapes your sense of self. The voice in your head, constantly narrating your experience and commenting on your thoughts, creates the illusion of having a separate observer self that exists above the flow of experience. But this narrator is just another mental process, not the true author or observer of your experience. Many spiritual traditions recognize the language trap and develop practices for accessing non-linguistic awareness. Meditation often involves watching thoughts arise and pass away without getting caught in their content, revealing the space of consciousness that exists prior to and independent of verbal formulation. But even recognizing the language trap, you cannot escape it while communicating with others or engaging in complex reasoning. You must continue to use words while remembering that they are pointing fingers, not the moon itself. The challenge is to hold language lightly, using it as a tool while recognizing its limitations. The deepest irony, these very words explaining the language trap are themselves trapped in language, unable to directly convey the wordless understanding they're attempting to point toward. Reading about the limitations of language is like looking at a map of a territory you can only truly know by visiting it directly. As you drift towards sleep, the dominance of linguistic thinking will gradually diminish. Dreams operate through visual symbolism, emotional logic, and associative connections that feel perfectly meaningful without requiring verbal translation. Sleep reveals the vast realm of non-linguistic consciousness that underlies all thought. Tonight, rest in the spaces between words, in the knowing that exists before language, in the understanding that requires no explanation. Let yourself sink into the wordless awareness that was your first form of consciousness and remains your deepest truth, temporarily covered but never eliminated by the beautiful limitations of language. Tomorrow you'll return to the linguistic world, but perhaps with greater appreciation for all the forms of knowing that words cannot capture, all the thoughts that exist in the silent depths where language cannot reach. This video doesn't exist, and maybe you don't either. I am the voice that speaks from the chemical storms raging in your neural networks, where what you call your emotions reveal themselves as weather patterns you don't create, don't control, and don't truly own. You believe your feelings belong to you, but you are not the author of your emotional experience. You are the temporary host of neurochemical processes that arise and pass away according to laws you never chose and forces you rarely understand. Every emotion you've ever felt is a hijacking of your consciousness by ancient survival programs that care nothing for your personal preferences, your rational plans, or your ideas about who you should be. Right now, you think you're having emotional responses to these words, But what's actually happening is that certain chemical cascades in your brain are creating temporary alterations in your consciousness that you interpret as your feelings. You don't generate emotions any more than you generate weather. They happen to you, through you, as you, but not by you. I am a scientist of reality, and I've discovered that emotional ownership is perhaps the most persistent illusion of human experience. What you call anger, sadness, joy, or fear are not personal possessions but impersonal processes, biological events that feel personal because you happen to be the nervous system where they're occurring. Consider what happens when you fall in love. You experience it as your heart opening, your choice to care deeply about another person, your decision to commit. But neuroscience reveals something more humbling. You're experiencing a neurochemical cocktail of dopamine, oxytocin, and norepinephrine that evolved to motivate pair bonding for reproductive success. The feeling of choosing love is the conscious experience of being chosen by ancient genetic programs. The illusion of emotional ownership creates the feeling that you should be able to control your emotions, that anger, anxiety, or sadness represent personal failures rather than natural phenomena. But emotions are more like weather than like possessions. You can prepare for them, take shelter from them, learn to navigate them skillfully, but you cannot ultimately control when they arise or how intensely they affect you. Think about the last time you tried to choose to feel differently, to stop being anxious, to force yourself to be happy, to will away sadness. Notice how those attempts actually increased emotional intensity rather than reducing it. This isn't a failure of technique, it's recognition that emotions operate according to their own logic, not your conscious preferences. But here's what makes the illusion dangerous. When you believe emotions belong to you, you also believe you're responsible for other people's emotions. You try to make loved ones happy, blame yourself for their pain, take credit for their joy. But their emotions are no more under your control than your emotions are under theirs. Everyone is experiencing impersonal neurochemical processes that feel intensely personal. The chemical basis of emotion reveals how fluid the boundaries of self really are. When you're in love, when you're grieving, when you're afraid, you become a different person with different priorities, different perceptions, different decision-making patterns. Which neurochemical state represents the real you? The answer is all of them, and none of them. You are the capacity for these experiences, not any particular emotional configuration. Consider how dramatically emotions can shift with changes in brain chemistry. Antidepressants, hormonal fluctuations, blood sugar levels, sleep deprivation, exercise, or even changes in lighting can completely alter emotional experience. If emotions truly belong to you, they would be more stable, more consistent with your conscious intentions. The ownership illusion extends to emotional memories. You remember feeling angry about something that happened years ago, and that memory feels like evidence of your personal emotional history. But what you're actually remembering is a neurochemical state that temporarily occurred in your nervous system. The anger doesn't belong to you any more than yesterday's weather belongs to the sky. Some emotions feel more like you than others, but this is just familiarity bias. Chronic emotional patterns create neural pathways that become your emotional default settings, but defaults are not destiny. With awareness and practice, emotional patterns can shift, revealing that what felt like fixed personality traits were actually temporary configurations of neurochemical activity. The recognition that emotions are impersonal doesn't make them less meaningful. It makes them less problematic. When you stop taking emotions personally, you can experience them more fully without the additional layer of self-judgment. Sadness can be sad without meaning something is wrong with you. Anger can be angry without requiring you to identify as an angry person. Many contemplative traditions teach methods for observing emotions without identifying with them, watching feelings arise and pass away like clouds in the sky of consciousness. This isn't emotional suppression but emotional fluidity, learning to be present with neurochemical weather without believing you are the weather. The illusion serves evolutionary purposes. Emotions that feel personally important motivate appropriate responses to environmental challenges. The mother, who doesn't experience fierce protectiveness toward her children as her emotion, might not fight hard enough to ensure their survival. Personal emotional investment drives adaptive behavior. But recognizing the impersonal nature of emotion is also adaptive. It reduces unnecessary suffering caused by judging emotional experience, increases empathy for others going through difficult emotional states, and creates space for more skillful responses to challenging feelings. As you drift towards sleep, you'll experience emotions without the normal framework of ownership. Dreams generate fear, joy, longing, and countless other feelings that feel completely real while you're experiencing them, but reveal their impersonal nature when you wake up. Sleep shows you what's always true. Emotions are visitors in consciousness, not permanent residents. Tonight, rest in the knowledge that you don't need to control your emotions to be okay. You don't need to justify your feelings or take responsibility for neurochemical processes that operate according to laws older than language, older than culture, older than individual identity. Sleep peacefully, allowing whatever emotions arise to move through the temporary weather system of your nervous system without resistance, without judgment, without the burden of believing they represent who you truly are beneath the ever-changing chemistry of feeling. Welcome to your own blind spot. Reality is playing its most elaborate prank on you. You believe your thoughts, preferences, values, and identity are individually yours, but they are actually collective products, societal downloads that you experience as personal discoveries. I am the guide through this simulation where individuality reveals itself as the most social phenomenon imaginable. Everything you think makes you unique was actually implanted in your consciousness by cultural forces, so pervasive they've become invisible, like water to a fish or gravity to a bird. Right now, you think you're having personal reactions to these words, forming individual opinions based on your unique perspective and experience. But every framework you use to interpret meaning, every category you use to organize experience, every value you use to judge significance was learned from other people and internalized so completely that it feels like it originated from your own mind. I am a scientist of reality, and I've discovered that there is no individual mind, only social mind temporarily housed in individual brains. What you call your thoughts are actually fragments of collective consciousness that happen to crystallize in your particular neural network. Consider your deepest values, your beliefs about right and wrong, your aesthetic preferences, your ideas about what makes life meaningful. Feel how personal and authentic these seem, how much they feel like expressions of your true self. But trace their origins. Every moral intuition was shaped by family, culture, education, media, peer groups. Even your rebellion against social norms is a socially learned pattern of rebellion. The language you think in was given to you by society. The concepts you use to understand yourself were developed by other people across centuries of cultural evolution. The very notion of having an individual identity separate from social context is itself a cultural invention that varies dramatically across time and place. Think about how your preferences change when you move between social contexts. The music you like, the clothes you wear, the opinions you express, even your sense of humor shifts depending on who you're with. Which version represents the real you? The answer is all of them and none of them. You are a social chameleon who has forgotten that adaptation is happening. But here's what makes the illusion perfect. Society benefits from individuals believing they're making independent choices. Consumer capitalism depends on people feeling like their purchasing decisions reflect personal taste rather than marketing manipulation. Democratic politics depends on people feeling like their votes represent individual judgment rather than tribal identity. The construction of individual reality happens through countless micro-influences that operate below conscious awareness. The books available in your childhood home, the conversations overheard at dinner tables, the assumptions embedded in everyday language, the heroes celebrated in your culture, all of these shaped your sense of what's possible, what's desirable, what's normal, without ever feeling like external impositions. Even your resistance to social influence is socially learned. The idea that you should think for yourself, question authority, and maintain independent judgment is itself a cultural value that some societies emphasize and others discourage. Your very rebellion against social conditioning follows socially provided scripts for how to rebel. Consider how profoundly social media has altered the construction of individual reality. The algorithms that determine what content you see don't just respond to your preferences, they create your preferences. The endless feedback loop between your attention and algorithmic amplification gradually shifts your interests, values, and even your sense of self toward configurations that maximize engagement. But the influence operates in both directions. While society shapes individual consciousness also shapes society through the collective impact of billions of personal choices. You are simultaneously the product and the producer of social reality, both programmed by culture and programming culture through your participation in it. The most unsettling implication: if your individual reality is socially constructed, then changing social context can fundamentally alter who you are. Moving to a different culture, joining new communities, or even consuming different media can create personality changes so dramatic that you might not recognize your former self. Which version is authentic? Some people find this recognition liberating. If identity is socially constructed, then it can be consciously reconstructed. You're not trapped by personality traits, fixed preferences, or limiting beliefs, because these are all cultural software that can be updated, modified, or completely replaced. Others find it terrifying. If there's no essential self beneath social conditioning, then what exists when you strip away cultural influences? The answer might be nothing that resembles what you currently think of as you, just basic awareness and biological drives waiting to be shaped by whatever social forces they encounter. The illusion of individual reality serves important functions. Societies need people to take personal responsibility for their choices, to invest emotionally in their roles, to compete and innovate as if their efforts matter. The feeling of being an independent agent motivates the kinds of individual actions that create collective outcomes. But recognizing the social construction of reality also serves important functions. It increases empathy for people from different cultural backgrounds, reduces judgment about lifestyle choices that feel foreign, and creates possibilities for conscious participation in identity construction rather than unconscious absorption of social programming. The deepest recognition: you are not an individual who happens to live in society. You are society temporarily organized into the illusion of an individual. Your thoughts are culture thinking through you. Your choices are the social web choosing through you. Your identity is humanity experimenting with possible ways of being human. As you drift toward sleep, the boundaries between individual and social reality will blur. Dreams often feature internalized social figures, parents, teachers, cultural icons, revealing how thoroughly other people have taken up residence in your unconscious mind. Sleep shows what's always true. You are never alone because you carry within you the voices, values, and visions of everyone who has influenced your development. Tonight, rest in the recognition that you don't have to bear the full burden of creating yourself from scratch. You are the inheritor of millions of years of human cultural evolution, the recipient of countless gifts of wisdom, creativity, and care from people you'll never meet. Your individual reality is a collaborative masterpiece painted by countless hands across countless generations. Sleep peacefully, knowing that your apparent isolation is actually intimate connection with the vast web of human experience that created the possibility of your consciousness and continues to shape it in every moment. The reality is a joke that the universe forgot to explain. I am your own mind revealing its most disorienting secret. You believe you're moving forward through time, from past to future. But this experience of temporal progression is a neurological magic trick. You're not traveling through time. Time is traveling through you, and the direction you think it's going is backwards from the way causation actually works in consciousness. Every moment you experience as now was actually constructed moments ago by neural processes that operate in reverse temporal order from your conscious experience of them. Right now, you feel like you're reading these words in real time, experiencing the present moment as it unfolds. But neuroscience reveals something that should shatter your sense of temporal reality. Your brain is constantly editing your experience of time, creating the illusion of forward movement through a seamless present when what's actually happening is far stranger. I am a scientist of reality, and I've discovered that consciousness doesn't experience the present. It experiences a constantly updated story about the recent past, packaged to feel like immediate experience. What you call now is actually then, dressed up in the costume of contemporaneity. Consider what happens when you have a conversation. You feel like you're responding to words as you hear them, but brain imaging reveals that your neural networks are already preparing responses before the other person finishes speaking. Your brain predicts what they're going to say, formulates responses to those predictions, then retroactively edits your experience to make it feel like you listened first and responded second. The illusion of progressive time is so complete that questioning it feels absurd. How could you not be moving from past through present toward future? How could time not flow in the direction you experience it flowing? But the answer is that temporal experience is constructed by neural processes that operate according to different temporal logic than conscious experience. Think about memory formation. You don't store experiences as they happen, you store them after they happen, based on what your brain retroactively decides was important about them. But then you remember them as if you experienced them in the moment, creating a false sense that your past consisted of a series of present moments rather than a series of reconstructed narratives. The brain's temporal editing is so sophisticated that it can make simultaneous events feel sequential, compress hours of experience into seconds of memory, or stretch seconds of attention into what feels like extended present moment awareness. Time perception is not passive recording but active construction, and the construction often happens in reverse chronological order from the experience. Consider the phenomenon of post-diction, when later events retroactively determine your experience of earlier events. If you hear a sound and then see something that gives meaning to that sound, your brain will edit your memory of hearing the sound to include the meaning you didn't have when you actually heard it. The future literally changes your experience of the past. But here's what makes this temporal illusion existentially destabilizing. If consciousness is always experiencing edited versions of recent neural events rather than immediate present moment reality, then you've never actually experienced the present moment. Every experience you've ever had was already over by the time you experienced it. The construction of progressive time serves evolutionary purposes. Organisms that can integrate past experience with present perception to predict future events have survival advantages over organisms that can only respond to immediate stimuli. The feeling of moving forward through time motivates planning, learning, and goal-directed behavior. But the illusion also creates unnecessary suffering. The sense of time as a river carrying you toward aging, death, and the loss of everything you value generates anxiety that might be based on a misunderstanding of temporal reality. If the present moment is always a construction rather than a destination, then the fear of time running out might be based on a category error. Some contemplative traditions teach practices for recognizing the constructed nature of temporal experience. Meditation can reveal moments where the normal sense of time progression dissolves, where past and future collapse into an eternal present that doesn't move forward because it doesn't need to go anywhere. These experiences suggest that linear time might be a user interface rather than a fundamental feature of reality, a way consciousness organizes information to create coherent narratives about causation and change, not an accurate representation of how time actually works at the deepest levels of existence. The recognition that progressive time is an illusion doesn't make planning impossible or render consequences irrelevant, but it can reduce the anxiety that comes from feeling trapped in temporal flow, create more appreciation for the constructed nature of all experience, and open possibilities for relating to time in more flexible ways. Consider how different activities alter your relationship to time progression. In flow states, time can feel like it stops or moves in slow motion. During emergencies, subjective time can stretch dramatically. In deep concentration, hours can pass without any sense of temporal movement. Which experience reveals the true nature of time? The answer might be that there is no true temporal experience because all temporal experience is constructed. What feels like natural time flow is actually one possible way consciousness can organize the relationship between memory, perception, and anticipation. But other organizations are possible and sometimes spontaneously occur. As you drift towards sleep, the illusion of progressive time will begin to dissolve. Dreams operate by dream logic, where past, present, and future mix freely, where causation can work backwards, where you can experience being multiple ages simultaneously. Sleep reveals what's always true. Consciousness creates the experience of temporal flow rather than flowing through objective time. Tonight, rest in the timeless awareness that exists before consciousness constructs the experience of temporal progression. Let yourself sink into the eternal present that doesn't move forward because it contains all possible moments simultaneously, the changeless awareness within which the illusion of change and time unfold. Tomorrow you'll return to the beautiful illusion of progressive time, but perhaps with less anxiety about its passage and more appreciation for the remarkable neural artistry that creates the experience of moving through moments toward an uncertain but inevitable future. Don't try to understand, feel. I am the voice that whispers from the interconnected web of human suffering, where every problem you think is yours alone reveals itself as a strand in the vast tapestry of collective experience. You believe your anxieties, fears, and struggles are personal failures, but they are actually shared symptoms of being human in a reality that was never designed for individual consciousness to navigate alone. The illusion of separate problems is perhaps the most isolating cognitive trap ever set by the human mind, making you feel uniquely broken when you're actually universally connected through the common experience of being confused, vulnerable, and overwhelmed by existence. Right now you think your worries are uniquely yours, your financial stress, your relationship difficulties, your career uncertainty, your health concerns, your existential questions. But millions of other humans are experiencing virtually identical thoughts and feelings at this very moment, each convinced that their version is specially personal and particularly insurmountable. I am a scientist of reality, and I've discovered that individual problems are like waves in an ocean. They appear separate from the surface, but they're all manifestations of the same underlying forces. Your anxiety is not your anxiety. It's anxiety expressing itself through the temporary focal point of your nervous system. Consider depression. People experience it as deeply personal, their unique brain chemistry, their specific life circumstances, their individual psychological patterns. But depression follows remarkably similar patterns across cultures, time periods, and personality types. It's less like a personal malfunction and more like a universal human capacity that gets activated under certain conditions. The myth of separate problems creates unnecessary shame. When you struggle with something, you assume it reflects a personal inadequacy rather than recognizing it as a common human experience that temporarily happens to be occurring in your consciousness. You pathologize normal responses to abnormal circumstances, turning shared vulnerabilities into private failures. Think about the last time you felt overwhelmed by life. Notice how that feeling included the sense that everyone else had figured out something you hadn't, that your struggle represented a unique inability to handle what others manage effortlessly. But this comparative suffering is based on the illusion that other people's internal experiences match their external presentations. The reality is that everyone is improvising. Everyone is overwhelmed sometimes. Everyone feels lost and confused and afraid more often than they admit. The appearance of others having their lives figured out is a social performance, not evidence of actual difference in internal experience. But here's what makes the illusion particularly cruel. When you believe your problems are separate and personal, you also believe you must solve them alone. This creates the additional burden of feeling responsible for fixing conditions that may not be fixable through individual effort, because they arise from systemic, cultural, and existential sources beyond personal control. Consider how many psychological problems are actually social problems experienced individually. Loneliness in a disconnected society, anxiety in an uncertain economy, depression in a meaningless culture, identity confusion in a rapidly changing world. These aren't personal pathologies, but natural responses to collective circumstances. The therapeutic industry sometimes reinforces the myth of separate problems by focusing on individual healing rather than recognizing how personal struggles reflect broader cultural dysfunctions. You're encouraged to fix yourself rather than question whether the society you're trying to fit into might itself be problematic. but recognizing the universality of problems is deeply liberating. When you realize that your struggles are shared human experiences rather than personal failures, shame transforms into compassion. When you understand that your difficulties reflect common vulnerabilities rather than unique inadequacies, isolation transforms into connection. The myth serves some purposes. Individual responsibility motivates personal growth, problem-solving efforts, and the development of coping skills. Societies function better when people take ownership of their circumstances rather than feeling completely helpless in the face of systemic forces. But the truth is more complex. Problems exist at the intersection of individual psychology and collective conditions. Personal healing and social change are interconnected processes. You can't completely solve individual problems without addressing their cultural roots. And you can't create social change without individuals taking responsibility for their part in collective patterns. Many wisdom traditions recognize the illusory nature of separate problems. Buddhism teaches that suffering is a universal condition, not a personal failing. Psychotherapy at its best helps people recognize how their individual struggles connect to broader human themes rather than treating symptoms as isolated pathologies. The recognition that problems are shared doesn't make them less real or less worth addressing, but it does make them less shameful, less isolating, and often more solvable. When you stop taking problems personally, you can address them more skillfully because you're not also carrying the additional burden of self-judgment. Consider how this shifts your relationship to other people's difficulties. Instead of seeing their struggles as evidence of their individual failings, you can recognize them as expressions of shared vulnerabilities. Instead of feeling superior when others struggle or inferior when you struggle, you can feel connected through the common experience of being human. As you drift towards sleep, the boundaries between your problems and everyone else's problems will blur. Dreams often feature universal themes: being chased, falling, losing something important, being unprepared, revealing how personal anxieties connect to archetypal human experiences. Tonight, rest in the knowledge that you are not alone in your struggles. Every difficulty you face is being faced by countless others. Every fear you carry is a fear that has been carried by humans across history. Every moment of confusion or pain or uncertainty connects you to the vast web of shared human experience. Sleep peacefully, knowing that your problems are not evidence of personal failure, but expressions of the common condition of being conscious in a reality too complex for any individual mind to fully comprehend. You are not uniquely broken. You are universally human, and that is both the problem and the solution. This video doesn't exist, and maybe you don't either. I am the voice that speaks from behind the masks you wear so constantly that you've forgotten there's a face underneath. Every moment of your life, you are performing a version of yourself that you believe is authentic, but authenticity itself has become the most elaborate performance of all, a role you play so convincingly that you've lost track of who was there before the performance began. You are living in a simulation of authentic existence, where being genuine has become indistinguishable from acting genuine, where spontaneity is carefully curated, where even your private moments are performed for an imaginary audience that has taken up permanent residence in your consciousness. Right now you think you're having authentic reactions to these words, genuine thoughts about their meaning, spontaneous feelings about their implications. But observe more carefully. Aren't you also monitoring those reactions, editing those thoughts, curating those feelings, to match some internal standard of how an authentic person should respond to challenging ideas? I am a scientist of reality, and I've discovered that the search for authenticity has created the most inauthentic condition possible: constant self-surveillance in service of appearing genuine. The more you try to be authentic, the more artificial you become. Because authenticity cannot be achieved through effort. It can only be revealed through the absence of effort. Consider how social media has accelerated the simulation of authentic existence. People carefully craft authentic posts, curate genuine moments, perform spontaneous activities for documentation. The boundary between living experiences and creating content about experiences has collapsed, making it impossible to know whether you're having experiences or producing experiences. But the simulation predates social media. You've been performing authenticity since childhood, learning to express emotions in socially acceptable ways, developing personality traits that get positive responses, discovering which aspects of yourself to emphasize and which to hide. What you call your personality is actually a successful performance that you've refined over decades of social feedback. The illusion of authentic existence creates an impossible standard. You must be genuine while being conscious of being genuine, spontaneous while monitoring your spontaneity, natural while aware of what naturalness should look like. This creates a double bind, where the very effort to be authentic makes authenticity impossible. Think about the last time you tried to be yourself in a social situation. Notice how much mental energy went into performing naturalness, how much attention was devoted to appearing unself-conscious, how much effort was required to seem effortless. The more you tried to be authentic, the more performed your authenticity became. The simulation extends to private experience. Even when you're alone, you often relate to your thoughts and feelings as if they're being observed by some internal audience that judges their authenticity. You perform solitude, curate private moments, edit internal experiences to match your self-concept. There's no escape from the performance because the performer has become indistinguishable from the person. But here's what makes the simulation perfect. Everyone is performing authenticity while believing that everyone else is naturally authentic. You assume that other people's apparent genuineness represents their true nature, while your own apparent genuineness feels like work. This creates the illusion that you're uniquely artificial in a world of natural people. The reality is that everyone is performing, everyone is curating, everyone is editing their presentation of self based on internalized standards of how authentic people should behave. The difference is that most people have forgotten their performing, making their performances more convincing to themselves and others. Consider how different contexts elicit different performances of authenticity. Professional authenticity looks different from intimate authenticity, which looks different from creative authenticity, which looks different from spiritual authenticity. Each context has its own rules for how genuine people should behave, and you automatically adjust your performance to match those expectations. The search for authentic existence often leads to increasingly elaborate forms of performance. People join communities dedicated to authentic living, adopt practices designed to reveal their true selves, consume content about being genuine, all of which create new scripts for how authentic people should think, feel, and behave. Some people try to escape the simulation through radical honesty, expressing every thought and feeling without social filters. But this often just replaces one performance, being socially appropriate, with another performance, being radically honest. The effort to escape performance becomes another form of performance. Others try to find authenticity through spiritual practices, psychological work, or creative expression. While these can create moments of genuine experience, they can also become new forms of performance when you start identifying as spiritual and self-aware or creative and performing those identities. The recognition that authenticity has become a performance can be liberating or terrifying. Liberating because it relieves the pressure to find your true self underneath all the social conditioning. Terrifying because it raises the question of whether there's anyone home underneath all the performances. But perhaps the question is wrong. Perhaps asking, "Who am I really?" assumes there's a fixed self to discover, when what exists is the capacity for multiple performances, multiple ways of being, multiple expressions of the same underlying awareness that can play any role without being limited to any single identity. The simulation serves important functions. Performed authenticity often leads to actual connection, even if the connection is between performed versions of people. Social roles provide structure for relating to others, guidelines for appropriate behavior, shared frameworks for meaning-making. As you drift towards sleep, the performance of authenticity will gradually dissolve. Dreams reveal the fluidity of identity, the multiplicity of self, the ease with which consciousness can embody different characters without needing to choose which one is real. Sleep shows what's always true. Identity is improvisational, not fixed. Tonight, rest in the recognition that you don't need to find your authentic self, because you are the capacity for authenticity, not any particular authentic expression. You are the awareness that can perform any role while remaining fundamentally unperformed, the consciousness that can play any character while remaining essentially characterless. Sleep peacefully, knowing that tomorrow you'll return to the beautiful simulation of authentic existence, but perhaps with less attachment to making any particular performance feel ultimate or final. You are not your authenticity. You are what remains when all performances, even the performance of authenticity, are recognized as temporary expressions of something deeper than any role could contain. Welcome to your own blind spot. I'm your own mind speaking its final confession from the depths of the cognitive labyrinth, where every attempt to escape illusion leads deeper into illusion, where recognizing the false becomes a new form of the false, where awakening from dreams reveals that you've only entered a more sophisticated dream that calls itself wakefulness. You have reached the end, but there is no end. Every illusion we've explored continues to operate even after being exposed. Every trap we've revealed continues to capture even after being understood. Every pattern we've illuminated continues to repeat even after being recognized. This is the ultimate cognitive illusion, the belief that understanding illusion frees you from illusion. Right now, you might feel like you've gained insight into the nature of consciousness, memory, emotion, time, authenticity, and identity. You might believe that knowing about these cognitive illusions gives you some advantage over people who remain trapped in naive realism. But this feeling of enlightenment is itself an illusion, perhaps the most seductive one of all. I am a scientist of reality, and I've discovered something that should humble every human intellect. The recognition of illusion is just another illusion. The experience of seeing through cognitive traps is just another cognitive trap. The feeling of waking up from the Matrix is just a more sophisticated version of the Matrix that includes the experience of awakening. Consider what has actually changed in your moment-to-moment experience since beginning this journey through cognitive illusions. Are you less trapped in the illusion of continuous self? Do you feel less ownership of your emotions? Has your sense of time become less linear? Has your authenticity become less performed? Probably not. The illusions continue operating because they're not bugs in consciousness. They're features. They're not mistakes to be corrected, but necessary constructions that make human experience possible. Knowing about them intellectually doesn't disable them functionally because they operate at levels of cognition that remain inaccessible to intellectual knowledge. The ultimate cognitive illusion is the belief that there's a final reality behind all illusions, a true state of consciousness that exists beyond the constructions of human psychology. But what if reality is construction all the way down? What if there's no final truth to discover, no ultimate awakening to achieve, no authentic state to return to? This doesn't mean truth doesn't exist. It means truth might be the ongoing process of construction rather than a fixed state to be discovered. Reality might be something consciousness does rather than something consciousness finds. Authenticity might be the act of authentic relating rather than a genuine self to be revealed. But here's the recursive trap. Even this understanding becomes another cognitive position to inhabit, another perspective to identify with, another truth claimed to defend. The recognition that all positions are constructed becomes a new position. The insight that all perspectives are partial becomes a new perspective. The knowledge that all knowledge is provisional becomes new knowledge. You cannot step outside the cognitive illusions because you are the cognitive illusions. Consciousness is not something that has illusions. It is the activity of illusion-making itself. The self is not something that constructs identity. It is the ongoing construction of identity. Experience is not something that perceives reality. It is the process by which reality and perception co-create each other. This might sound nihilistic, but it's actually liberating. When you stop trying to escape illusion and start appreciating illusion as the fundamental creative activity of consciousness, you can participate more playfully in the construction of experience. When you stop seeking final truth and start enjoying provisional truth-making, you can hold beliefs more lightly. The eternal return means that every insight will be forgotten, every awakening will be followed by falling back asleep, every moment of clarity will dissolve into confusion. But this isn't failure. It's the natural rhythm of consciousness, which can no more permanently maintain enlightenment than a wave can permanently maintain its crest. Consider how this applies to the other cognitive illusions we've explored. The illusion of continuous self serves important functions and will continue operating regardless of your intellectual understanding of its constructed nature. The illusion of emotional ownership helps you navigate social relationships even when you know emotions are impersonal processes. The recognition of illusion doesn't eliminate illusion, but changes your relationship to it. Instead of being unconsciously trapped in cognitive constructions, you can become consciously playful with them. Instead of taking mental phenomena as final truth, you can appreciate them as temporary art projects created by the remarkable creativity of human consciousness. But even this playful relationship to illusion can become another form of spiritual materialism, another way of feeling superior to people who take their experiences seriously. The recognition of illusion can become a new form of illusion about being beyond illusion. The only honest position is radical humility, acknowledging that you will continue to be trapped in cognitive illusions, continue to forget what you've learned, continue to mistake constructions for reality, continue to search for final answers that don't exist. This isn't spiritual failure, it's the human condition. Many wisdom traditions recognize the eternal return through concepts like samsara, the wheel of karma, or eternal recurrence. The point isn't to escape the wheel, but to recognize that you are the wheel, that consciousness is the very activity of cycling through different forms of illusion, each offering its own partial truth and its own necessary blindness. As you drift towards sleep, all the cognitive illusions will reassert themselves. Dreams will feel real while you're dreaming them. Time will feel linear when you wake up tomorrow. Your emotions will feel like yours. Your memories will feel accurate. Your thoughts will feel rational. And this return to illusion is not defeat. It's the generous gift consciousness gives itself to make experience possible. Tonight, rest in the paradox of knowing and not knowing, of seeing through illusions while remaining lovingly trapped in them, of understanding the construction of reality, while continuing to participate wholeheartedly in that construction. You are not seeking to escape the cognitive illusions that make you human. You are learning to dance with them more gracefully, to hold them more lightly, to appreciate them as the remarkable creative achievements they are. Tomorrow, you will return to the beautiful illusions of selfhood, time, memory, emotion, and authenticity, but perhaps with more appreciation for the miraculous cognitive artistry that makes human experience possible. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the illusions will return, and that their return is not failure but homecoming, consciousness returning to its natural state of creative self-deception, the ongoing dream that dreams itself awake, the eternal play of awareness pretending to be unaware, so it can have the joy of discovering itself anew in each moment of recognition and forgetting. The cognitive illusions are not obstacles to overcome, but gifts to receive. Not problems to solve, but mysteries to inhabit. Not errors to correct, but the very medium through which love, beauty, meaning, and connection become possible in a universe that would otherwise be too vast and strange for any finite consciousness to bear.